in chapter 6 of Genesis, it talks about a 300 cubit long boat. If you use the Egyptian cubit, it's 515 feet long, or about 157 meters, and that's exactly the length of this boat-shaped object.
The survey team was not supposed to find anything unusual. They were conducting a standard seismic mapping run across a remote ridge in eastern Turkey, equipment humming, monitors casting blue light across bored faces. Nobody was looking for history. Nobody expected it. Then the screen changed. A hollow structure appeared in the data. Not a cave, not a collapsed tunnel. Something else entirely. Something with walls. Something with internal divisions. Something with dimensions that a geologist immediately recognized were too precise, too deliberate, too consistent to have been carved by water or time. The team leader reached over and silenced the radio. Nobody spoke. One of the engineers slowly turned from the monitor and looked at the man beside him without saying a word. They both understood. If these readings were accurate, they had just found something that was not supposed to exist. And the longer they stared at the data, the clearer it became that whatever was buried beneath this mountain had not ended up there by accident. It had been placed there, and perhaps more disturbing than that thought was the next one that followed it. Whatever was inside had never been removed. The shape beneath the mountain. Within hours of the first anomaly, the team expanded the scan radius and began building a clearer picture of the structure below. What emerged on their monitors was not the kind of shape that geology produces. Rock fractures in irregular patterns. Collapsed ground creates uneven voids. What the radar was painting on the screen was a vessel. The length registered at roughly 300 cubits. The width came in at approximately 50. The height held steady at 30. For most of the team, those numbers were just numbers. But for the biblical scholar embedded in the expedition, they were something else entirely. He stood up from his chair, walked to the monitor, and quietly read aloud from Genesis 6:15. Those were the exact dimensions God gave Noah for the ark. The room sat with that for a moment. Then the arguments started. An archaeologist insisted the measurements were coincidental. A geologist suggested the scan resolution was too low to be meaningful. But the engineer who had been running the equipment for 11 years looked at both of them and said something that ended the debate for the night. He told them that natural rock does not produce evenly spaced parallel interior divisions. Whatever this was, it had rooms. The deeper scans confirmed it. The interior of the structure was divided into multiple levels. The lower sections showed compartmentalized areas separated by what appeared to be solid beams, arranged in a repeating pattern. The upper sections contained longer, open spans. It looked nothing like geology. It looked exactly like a ship designed to carry thousands of living things across an ocean with no shore in sight. By the time the team broke for the night, nobody was arguing anymore. They were just afraid. Warmth where there should be nothing. The second morning brought a thermal imaging run. This was intended as a routine confirmation step, a way of ruling out underground heat vents or geothermal activity that might explain some of the unusual readings. Instead, it added a new layer of dread to an already unsettled camp. One of the lower chambers was warm, not dramatically, not blazing, just a faint but unmistakable thermal signature that stood out against the cold surrounding rock like a single lit window in an empty building at midnight. The biologist on the team immediately rejected the result. Equipment error, interference, sensor calibration. She ran through every explanation she could find and dismissed the reading, so they ran it again. And then a third time, with fresh calibration and a different instrument. The signature appeared each time, in the same location, the same shape, the same faint warmth rising from a chamber that had been sealed underground for a span of time that most of the team could not even conceptualize. The warmth was not coming from outside. It was not geothermal drift. The thermal pattern suggested that something inside that sealed chamber was generating its own heat. Nobody said it out loud at first, but everyone in the room was thinking the same thing. Buried structures do not stay warm on their own. The only things that produce sustained internal heat are things that are alive, or things that are waiting to be. Metal echoes in ancient wood. The third phase of scanning used deeper radar pulses, and what they returned shattered whatever remaining comfort anyone had been holding on to. Scattered throughout the interior of the structure, the echoes were bouncing back with the acoustic signature of metal. This was not a small anomaly in one section. The metal signatures appeared across multiple areas, distributed through the walls and internal framework in a pattern that the engineers immediately recognized. It was not random contamination. It was structural reinforcement. The metal had been placed inside the wooden construction deliberately. in locations that would stabilize and strengthen the vessel under extreme stress. The problem with that was simple and devastating. The civilization that supposedly built this ship, if the biblical timeline held, would have been a Bronze Age culture at most. And no Bronze Age culture had the knowledge, the materials, or the engineering capability to build a reinforced wooden vessel of this scale. The level of structural thinking on display in the scan data was not primitive. It was not improvised, it was precise. One engineer sat back in his chair and said quietly that the construction methodology they were looking at was not from the ancient world. He did not mean it as a supernatural statement. He meant it as a purely technical one. Whatever culture built this structure understood load-bearing physics, internal stress distribution, and material science in ways that should not have existed at the time. The room absorbed that. Then someone asked the obvious question. If this was not built with ancient technology, then what built it? And more importantly, what was it built to hold? The warning that came before the shutdown. One of the researchers had been quiet for most of the previous 2 days. He was not a geologist or an engineer. He was a theological historian, brought on to provide cultural context in case any inscriptions or artifacts were found. He had been taking notes steadily, watching everything, saying very little. On the third evening, he finally spoke. He pointed out that Jesus, in Matthew 24:37, made a direct connection between the days of Noah and the end of the age. The verse reads that the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. Jesus then goes on to describe what those days looked like. People were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. They knew nothing about what would come until the flood took them all away. The historian explained what Jesus was saying in plain terms. In Noah's time, the warning was given clearly. The ark was visible. The preaching had been going on for generations, and still people paid no attention. They continued their routines. They treated every signal as an overreaction. They ignored what was in front of them until the moment the door closed and the water began to rise. Then he said something that made the room uncomfortable. He said that the discovery they were looking at was itself a kind of signal, and he asked them honestly whether they thought the world, if it saw this data, would receive it differently than Noah's generation received their warning. That question hung in the air for a long time, and before anyone could answer it, another researcher said that the scans should never be released. He said it quietly, without drama, and nobody in the room argued with him. The site was shut down 48 hours later. The official explanation was administrative and vague. No one from the team ever publicly confirmed what they found, but several of them carried the data with them when they left, and eventually, some of it surfaced. The chamber that breathes. Before the shutdown, the team made one final attempt to physically access the structure. A microbore probe was inserted through the outer wall of the sealed lower chamber, the one that had produced the thermal signature. It was thin enough to pass through without causing meaningful structural damage, and it carried sensors for atmosphere, radiation, pressure, and chemical composition. The moment the probe tip cleared the inner wall, the radiation detector on the console began to move. The screen shifted from green to yellow within the first 30 seconds. By the time the probe was fully seated, it had moved to orange. Green means normal. Yellow means elevated. Orange means caution. The team stared at the colors and said nothing. Buried wood does not emit radiation. Sealed stone chambers do not emit radiation. Whatever was behind that wall was producing energy that had no geological explanation. The source of the radiation could not be identified from the probe data alone, but its presence confirmed that the chamber was not simply an empty room. Something inside it was actively interacting with its environment. Then the pressure sensor began to move. It rose slightly, held, then fell, then rose again. The pattern repeated at a slow, even interval. One engineer stared at the readout for a long time before he said what everyone else was already seeing. The pressure inside the sealed chamber was rising and falling in a rhythm. Not erratically, not in response to any external vibration or temperature shift. Steadily, patiently, like breathing. No one laughed at the comparison, no one dismissed it. The team simply documented the reading and kept their distance from the wall. Whatever was inside that chamber had been sealed in there for a very long time. And based on the data, it had not stopped. The pitch that was never meant to decay. The chemical analysis from the probe returned results that pushed the team deeper into territory none of them had been trained to navigate. The inner walls of the chamber were coated in a thick black substance. On first identification, It registered as a bitumen-based pitch, consistent with the material described in Genesis 6:14, where God instructs Noah to coat the ark inside and out with pitch. But this pitch was not ordinary. Embedded within the organic base material were crystalline particles that did not match any mineral composition found in the region. Under microscopic analysis, those crystals showed a repeating internal structure, a lattice pattern that did not occur naturally in bitumen or in any geological formation near the site. The pattern looked manufactured. It looked designed. The biblical scholar on the team drew the group's attention to the original Hebrew word used for pitch in Genesis. The word is kopher. It appears only twice in the entire Hebrew Bible. Once in the Ark account, and once as the word for atonement, the act of covering something to contain or neutralize its danger. In the sacrificial system, atonement was not simply forgiveness. It was a deliberate covering, a sealing of something that could not be allowed to spread. The implication was not subtle. The pitch on the walls of this chamber may not have been applied primarily to keep water out. It may have been applied to keep something in, and the engineered crystals embedded in it suggested that the people who designed this containment understood, at a level beyond their known technology, exactly what they were trying to hold. The chamber had not been sealed by accident, or even just by practical necessity. It had been sealed the way you seal something that must never be allowed to come out. The bones that belong to no world we know. The probe's secondary camera revealed a connecting passage running alongside the main chamber, narrow enough that only remote equipment could enter it. When the team sent a mechanical arm through, they expected debris, collapsed wood, sediment, the normal archaeology of ruin. What the camera found instead stopped everyone cold. Arranged across the floor of the passage were skeletal remains, not scattered randomly as bones typically fall when a creature dies and decomposes in place. These had been stacked, organized, placed in a configuration that one researcher described as deliberate rather than incidental. He said it looked less like a death scene and more like a disposal site. The bones themselves were deeply wrong. The rib structure was compressed far beyond what any known mammal displays. The spacing between each rib was so tight that a normal lung would have had no room to inflate inside that chest. The jaw showed a double hinge mechanism, a structural feature that would allow the mouth to open at an angle and to a width far beyond any creature in the existing biological record. The teeth were arranged in an alternating pattern of long and short, suggesting a function that no modern predator or prey animal has ever needed. The vertebrae were the most disturbing detail. Instead of forming a straight or gently curved column, each vertebra connected to the next at a slight rotational offset, creating a spine that would have spiraled slightly down the length of the body. No documented species, living or extinct, has a spine built this way. DNA analysis was run immediately. The sequencing equipment flagged every sample as unknown, not unknown as in degraded and unreadable, unknown as in no match in any database on Earth. The software could not place these bones in any known biological family. Not mammal, not reptile, not bird, not fish, not any branch of the tree of life as currently understood. The geneticist on the team said what the data forced her to say. These creatures, whatever they were, belonged to a biological line that no longer exists on Earth and may not have existed anywhere after the flood. The scholar opened his Bible to Genesis 6:4 and read it aloud. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. He explained the passage carefully. The Nephilim were not ordinary animals. They were not ordinary humans. They represented a corruption of the created order, a mixing that God had not sanctioned. If Noah was commanded to preserve every clean kind aboard the ark, then the question of what happened to the corrupted kinds demanded an answer. These bones, stacked deliberately in a sealed passage, may have been that answer. The marks that face the wrong direction. As the mechanical arm moved further into the passage, the camera swept across the wooden walls on both sides. They were marked, not by weathering or the natural deterioration of material under pressure, marked by something that had been inside the passage and had dragged itself across the surface with force. Claw marks. Long, deep grooves pressed into the hardened wood, the direction of each one visible and consistent. They all faced inward, not outward, toward the exit, not toward the light. Every single mark on both walls of that tunnel had been made by something moving away from the entry point, deeper into the structure and fighting against that direction as it went. Whatever left those marks was not trying to escape from the ark. It was being forced further in, and it was resisting with everything it had. The team sat with that image for a long time. The passage was not just a storage area, it was a route along which something had been moved under duress toward a sealed destination in the final hours before the flood began. The creature that left those marks had understood where it was going, and it had not wanted to go there. Someone asked whether the bones they had found earlier could have come from whatever made those marks. Nobody had a good answer, but everyone in the room was thinking the same thing. The Ark was not only a vessel of rescue, part of it had been a prison, and the prisoner had never been released. A language from before the world divided. The passage widened as the arm moved deeper, and when the camera panned to the far wall of the expanded corridor, the team saw something none of them had anticipated. The surface of the wall was not plain wood. It was covered entirely in carved markings, pressed into the resin-like pitch layer that lined the interior. Row after row of symbols, deliberate and consistent, running from one end of the corridor to the other. The linguist on the team leaned close to the monitor and studied the shapes for a long time before speaking. He said the script bore a surface resemblance to Proto-Sinaitic writing, one of the earliest alphabetic systems ever documented. But the resemblance was superficial. The underlying structure was different. The symbol set was larger. The organizational logic was more complex. He said it looked like something that Proto-Sinaitic might have descended from, not something derived from it. His conclusion was careful, but stunning. The language on these walls appeared to predate every known writing system. If the biblical timeline was applied, it could only have originated from a period before Genesis 11, before the Tower of Babel, before the division of human languages. It might be the closest surviving record of the single tongue spoken by all of humanity before the world was scattered. The team worked through the night to photograph and document every symbol. Using pattern analysis and structural comparison, a partial translation was assembled. It was incomplete. It was uncertain. But 3 phrases emerged with enough clarity to record. The first read, "Bind the corrupted forms." The second read, "Seal them until the fire comes." The third phrase stopped everyone. It read, "Do not unseal before the appointed end." Those were not construction notes. They were not cargo manifests. They were instructions for containment, written by someone who believed that what they were sealing inside the Ark would remain sealed until a specific moment in a future they could not see. And that moment had not yet come. The map Noah carved himself. Embedded among the inscriptions were diagrams. They were not decorative. They were functional. Each one showed a cross-section of the vessel from above, with specific chambers and passages marked in a way that was clearly intentional. Some of the marked areas carried additional symbols, a repeated glyph that the scholar identified as a warning marker based on its placement and context. The team took the diagrams and mapped them against the scan data they had accumulated over the previous 3 days. The structural layout of the diagrams and the structural layout of the buried vessel aligned with a precision that was impossible to dismiss. The carvings matched the scans as if one had been made from the other, except that the carvings predated the scans by thousands of years. Noah had mapped his own ship, and on that map, he had marked every sealed chamber. The largest warning marker on the carved diagram sat at the location of the chamber the team had already identified, the one with the radiation signature, the one with the pressure readings that rose and fell like breathing, the one whose walls were coated in engineered pitch. Noah himself had looked at whatever was behind that wall and decided it needed to be marked separately from everything else. That confirmation was the heaviest moment of the entire expedition, because it meant that everything the team had been discovering, the heat, the radiation, the rhythmic pressure, the deliberate inscriptions, was not an accident of preservation or a misread of the data. It was intentional. It had been known, and it had been left there on purpose, with a warning carved in a language older than every civilization on Earth, waiting for whoever came next. The door at the deepest point. The final thing the camera found was a door. It sat at the terminus of the deepest accessible passage, and unlike everything else in the structure, it was not made of plain wood. It was reinforced. Multiple horizontal beams braced it from the corridor side, and the frame around it had been packed with the same crystalline pitch found in the main chamber. It was built to absorb force from the inside, not from the outside. The door was not locked to keep people out. It was barred to keep something in. The inscriptions around the frame were carved in thicker, deeper strokes than anything found earlier in the corridor. The linguist assessed them as having been written under urgency, not the careful documentation of the earlier passages. These markings had been made quickly by someone who wanted to finish the message before the moment passed. Several of the symbols were incomplete, trailing off mid-character as if time had run out before the carving could be finished. One phrase from the doorframe was translated with reasonable confidence. It read, "What is sealed here answers to a higher court. Do not stand before this threshold without authority." The team looked at the door on the monitor for a long time. Nobody suggested opening it. Nobody even suggested getting closer. The mechanical arm was retracted. The probe was withdrawn. The bore hole was sealed. And within 2 days, the entire site was closed by authorities who offered no public explanation. The equipment was removed. The field camp was dismantled. The area was cordoned. Whatever permits had allowed the expedition to operate were quietly revoked. The team dispersed. Some of them took copies of the data. Most of them said very little about what they had seen. In Matthew 24, Jesus does not simply describe the flood as a historical event. He uses it as a mirror. He holds it up so that the people hearing him can see their own reflection. He says that in Noah's day, people ate and drank and married and went about their lives right up to the moment the flood came. They had every warning available to them. The ark was standing in front of them, and they did not receive it. Then Jesus says, "So it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." The implication is not complicated. The pattern repeats. The warnings are given. The signs are visible to anyone willing to look at them. And most people, in both eras, continue their routines and dismiss every signal as someone else's problem or someone else's obsession or a misreading of the data. 2 Peter 2:4 adds another dimension to what the team found buried in Turkey. It states that God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into darkness and committed them to chains, to be held for judgment. The earliest Christian and Jewish writings consistently connect this verse to the corruption described in Genesis 6, to the Nephilim, to the beings whose remains may have been stacked deliberately in a sealed passage inside a vessel that was also a prison. If what the team found is what it appears to be, then Noah did not simply build a boat and fill it with animals. He participated in a containment operation. He sealed corrupted beings inside a structure built to survive a global catastrophe, using materials and techniques that should not have existed at his time, following instructions that came directly from God. And he marked every sealed area on a carved map, in a language that predated every known civilization, with warnings that were addressed not to his own generation, but to whoever came after. To whoever came after. The question that the discovery forces is not a comfortable one. The door at the deepest point of that structure is still there. The chamber with the radiation and the rhythmic pressure is still there. The bones that belong to no known species are still there. The inscriptions that read, "Do not unseal before the appointed end," are still there. And the world outside that mountain is doing exactly what Jesus described, eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, moving through its routines, paying no particular attention to what has been sealed, and why, and for how long. Noah spent generations building a warning that most people in his time never received. The ark itself was the warning. And now, buried under a mountain in eastern Turkey, whatever he was instructed to seal inside that warning is still waiting. Jesus said, the last days would look like Noah's days. Look around, then decide whether the door at the end of that passage should concern you. Because the inscription did not say it would stay sealed forever. It said it would stay sealed until the end.